Good morning. Welcome to Understanding California's Funding Crisis, why it's happening, what it means, and how it can be resolved. I'm John Fensterwald, editorial writer for the San Jose Mercury News, and this is the first event of the California Media Collaborative, a new nonprofit initiative for enhancing coverage of key California issues. This event is co-sponsored by the Commonwealth Club of California, the National Educators Writers Association, and Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Race, Ethnicity, and Diversity at UC Berkeley Law School. I thank in particular Kathy Barron and Louis Friedberg for their work in organizing this event. Thank all of you who are on the webcast. You can participate with your questions by emailing them to dw127@media.berkeley.edu. And actually, we'd appreciate if you just send us an email to let us know that you're watching our event today. Governor Schwarzenegger has proposed a $4.8 billion cut for K-12 schools and community colleges as part of his across-the-board $8 billion budget cut. This amounts to about $750 per child or $24,000 per classroom. We've been through fire drills before, but never a fire of this magnitude. Our panelists today will offer three perspectives on the budget. Elizabeth Hill will give her office's alternative to the governor's budget, which would produce more revenue and a lot more money for education. Rick Pratt will describe the impact of the proposed cuts on schools and children. Goodwin Liu will present a different way of funding schools altogether, looking ahead past the immediate crisis to a discussion of how to reform California's education. Elizabeth Hill has been California's legislative analyst for 22 years. The LAO has been giving nonpartisan fiscal and policy advice to the legislature for more than 65 years. When Liz announced that she plans to retire this summer, the Sacramento Bee's response was, "Why take all this talent and institutional experience and then waste it on the golf links? She should run for governor." For the past 8 years, Rick Pratt has been Assistant Executive Director for the California School Boards Association in charge of governmental relations. He is one of California's top education finance experts responsible for the development of the association's political and legislative strategies. Professor Goodwin Liu joined the faculty of the Bolt Hall School of Law at the University of California at Berkeley in 2003. His primary areas of expertise are constitutional law, education policy, and civil rights. He is co-director of the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Race, Ethnicity, and Diversity at the law school. Again, you can participate with your questions by emailing them to dw127@media.berkeley.edu. Liz Hill, why don't you start?
Thank you very much, John, and I appreciate the kind introduction. As you mentioned at the outset, the state is facing a major budget problem, and as our office looked at the numbers and the way California's economy was going, rather than a $14.5 billion budget problem identified by the governor, we identified a $16 billion budget problem, which is for the current year and the budget year combined. As you see in the slide here, we have a website, and all of the information that I'll be offering today is on that site, www.lao.ca.gov. I think the good news in terms of the state's budget problem is the legislature did meet in special session and has addressed roughly half of the budget problem that we identified back in February. I'd like to focus on education in particular, and the first slide shows the governor's proposal for K-14 education, Proposition 98, if you will. It's important to note that Proposition 98 is really the largest program in the state budget. If you look for funding for K-14 education, general fund funding alone is about $39 billion, or 39% of the overall budget. The governor took an approach in his budget of across-the-board cuts in each general fund budget in the state's budget situation. And what you see here is that the governor is proposing a suspension of the Proposition 98 guarantee by $4 billion. The governor's budget doesn't provide the COLA and does reduce all programs from the current year's spending level. In the case of most categorical programs, this is a 6 to 7% cut. In the case of revenue limits or general purpose funding for education, the cut is about 3%. I think there's been a lot of confusion about the numbers and what is the degree of reduction, and so I included this chart just to try to offer some perspectives on the governor's Proposition 98 reductions. You mentioned in your opening, John, that the reduction is $4.8 billion. Well, that's the top line of this chart, and that's based on the way the Department of Finance, the governor's finance office, put the budget together, which was to identify what were the ongoing needs of K-14 education, including making up for some one-time money in the current year budget and putting in ongoing support. And so actually the workload budget would generate a figure of $60.4 billion. So the difference between that and the actual funding level in the budget is that $4.8 billion reduction. Another way to look at it is what is the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee, and that's the second line in the chart. And you see the difference between the Prop 98 guarantee and the funding level in the budget is a difference of $4 billion, and that's actually the $4 billion suspension proposed by the governor. I think it's really also important for your viewers to know what are schools spending now on programmatic, ongoing support in K-14 education, and that's the third line of $57.7 billion. And the difference between that and the governor's funding level is $2.1 billion. So another way to think about it is the governor's proposal is a cut of $2.1 billion from what the ongoing support is for Proposition 98 today. Now, in the next chart, we show our LAO alternative budget. We were concerned that the governor's across-the-board approach across all areas of state government failed to set priorities in either the near term or the long term. So we offered an alternative budget that includes about $11 billion in program reductions, but also includes $2.7 billion in revenue increases. Because in good economic times, the state of California both lowered taxes and lowered revenues, and so we felt it was important that revenues also be in the equation in terms of addressing the state's major problem. Our goal in our LAO alternative budget, which is included in our perspectives and issues, which is available on the web, was to try to maintain current services across the board, both in education and in other program areas. We also were concerned with regard to community colleges that we maintain access for students to attend community colleges, and that was an area where we felt, too, that the governor had cut back. But our LAO alternative, in short, restores ongoing funding for ongoing programs that currently are being supported with one-time monies. We do make growth-related adjustments. Our alternative does not provide the cost of living adjustment required by current law, and neither does the governor. We do fully fund the ongoing cost of mandates because we recognize that's a program expense of districts, and we do make targeted program reductions. These total about $180 million, and they're largely in areas where we felt that there was either duplication, the programs were poorly structured, there were declines in participation, or frankly, there was technical over-budgeting. Compared to the governor, we would go further in terms of going down to the minimum guarantee in the current year, and I'd say the other main aspect of our proposal is to suspend the second year of funding for the Quality Education Investment Act. That's $450 million. Our concern is to expand a relatively new program that just started in the current year in 2008-09 when we're not funding COLA and we're not maintaining services would be really a lack of priority setting on the state's part. Now, the next slide just puts into perspective what I've just mentioned in terms of the comparison between our alternative budget and the governor's budget. The governor's budget is on the left. The white bar you see is the $4 billion suspension and the funding level. You see the LAO alternative on the right. That funding level is $2.1 billion higher. That maintains the current level of support, ongoing program support of schools. Because our proposal does include revenue increases, it still would require a suspension about $800 million compared to the $4 billion suspension of the governor. I think the last area that I really wanted to touch on, particularly given that Professor Liu is also on the panel today, is a middle-of-a-road approach to reform that we offer in our analysis this year. It's a middle road between the getting down to facts report in terms of total reform and the status quo, and we do that by reforming and offering a reform package of converting a number of categorical programs into four block grants. It'd be fair to say for nearly 20 years, the Legislative Analyst's Office has recommended that the legislature consolidate and rationalize the school finance system. We think getting down to facts has a number of very important points. We thought, however, given the current fiscal situation, it would be difficult to do the total reform envisioned in the report. And when you look at categorical programs, there are 62 categorical programs currently. About 30 of those 62 have less than $50 million of funding. Some of the categorical programs have subparts. For example, child development has 8 different subparts. Special education has 15 subprograms. And so our goal in offering a reform package is to give greater flexibility to school districts, to also have a thematic approach to accountability, to offer about 80% of the Proposition 98 money to be affected by these 4 block grants, to not alter the current distribution of funds. So if a school district is receiving an amount of special education today, that would be the amount they would receive under our consolidation program. And then ultimately, we recommend that the legislature do away with most of the underlying program requirements in these subject areas. I think the last slide just highlights the benefits in our view of categorical reform, the flexibility to meet local priorities because we recognize that not all school districts are the same, the ability to find local solutions to problems, an increased focus on outcomes to ensure legislative oversight and also that districts are spending the money the way the state intentioned, and also to have an increased understanding of resources and options that are available in K-14 education. So that's a brief summary of our alternative program, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to email your questions to dw127@media.berkeley.edu. So Rick, talk about the budget, its impact on districts and schools and children from your perspective at the school.
Okay, well, I think a good place to start when we talk about the impact of the budget on local school districts is to talk a little bit first about the budget adoption process at the local level, because that affects the kinds of actions that districts have to start taking now. The law requires districts to adopt their budgets by July 1st of every year. That law applies whether or not the state has adopted its budget, and of course the state budget is the primary determinant of what local school district budgets are. So recognizing that, there also is a later date in September for school districts to adopt revised budgets based on what the state budget actually is. And then we also have the requirement for certificated employees to give them March 15th layoff notices if there is a chance that they may not be rehired in the subsequent year. Teachers who don't get that layoff notice cannot be laid off in the following year. So then that sort of provides sort of some of the basic groundwork of what districts are facing at the local level. Then we have the governor's budget proposal, and that comes out in January. And right now, that is the only real proposal out there. We know that there are going to be changes to that proposal before the legislature finally adopts it and the governor signs it. We don't know what those changes are going to be. The governor's proposal is what actually is contained in the budget bill as it now sits in the legislature. The legislative budget subcommittees are holding hearings on the budget, but they're not making any decisions. Basically, they're hearing the different issues as information items. The analyst has come out with her recommendations, but no actions have been taken on those recommendations. So the prudent thing for districts to do at the local level is to, right now, treat the governor's budget proposal as reality, in the sense that then they have to sort of plan for the worst, but then hope for the best. And so that's why you're seeing around the state a lot of districts issuing layoff notices, a lot of districts, in fact, making budget cuts in the current year in order to create some sort of buffer in the budget year, because one way of dealing with budget shortfall or cut next year is to maximize your ending balance this year. So we see some districts that are trying to do that. There have been questions about why some districts are laying off large numbers of teachers or issuing the large numbers of March 15th notices, and other teachers are not, or other districts are not. And it really varies from district to district, and there can be a lot of different factors that go into that kind of decision making. One would be just what size of a reserve a district may have. Districts have to have minimum reserves based on their enrollment, but a lot of districts have reserves that are above that minimum level. And districts that have larger reserves would feel a smaller need to issue layoff notices. It depends on where districts might be in terms of their teacher demographics and the salary schedule. You can have two different districts that have identical salary schedules, but if one district has older, more experienced teachers that are higher on that schedule than another district, then they're going to be faced with higher payroll costs. So there are a lot of different factors that go into how individual districts may approach it. I've actually heard of one district that has decided not to issue any layoff notices at all, pretty much as an act of political defiance, to say we're not going to do this. We are already at the bare minimum, and we're just going to cross our fingers and hope that in the final analysis we'll have enough money to support the level of teaching staff that we currently have. So you see a lot of those kinds of impacts at the local level, and then it for us, and I think for our communities in California, it's not just a numbers game. It's not just about the dollars that, you mentioned the $750 per student figure. It's not just X number of teachers. It's not just class size. It's about after-school programs that are at risk right now, because these are the programs that we use to address the needs of our lowest performing students and bring them up to the standards that we've set for them. It is some summer programs. In the district where I live, in fact, where Liz lives, they're talking about eliminating their summer school programs now because there's not going to be the revenue to support it. Again, these are the programs that we use to deal with the struggling students. And so the final thing that I would note is that, when we hear a lot about the need for school districts to tighten their belts, and after all, when businesses are faced with a similar situation, businesses have to tighten their belts, and it's a good analogy, but then usually it stops right there. And we don't hear about the very next step of that analogy, which is, yes, when districts do layoffs, or when businesses lay off staff, when they buy fewer inputs, they also cut back on production. And that's not an option that's available to us in schools. We are not talking about going back on academic standards. We're not going back on the need to meet the federal adequate yearly progress requirements under No Child Left Behind. We're not talking about loosening up our own academic performance index goals in California. So cutting back on production, cutting back on what it is schools are expected to achieve is not an option that's before us. And so it makes it very, very difficult then at the local level to continue to strive to meet those standards, which are, often recognized as the highest and most the toughest in the country, with dwindling resources. So we appreciate the analyst recommendation in terms of the additional funding that she would recommend. Certainly a $2.3 billion cut is much better than a $4.3 billion cut, but it's still a cut. And it would be a very, very difficult situation for districts to face next year as well.
Thank you. So Goodwin, take us past this crisis and talk about, after all, the goal is to provide education for all children adequately and equitably. So talk about your way of making that happen in the future.
Sure. Thank you, John, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Liz and Rick. Well, as you mentioned, John, I'm pleased to announce today that the Earl Warren Institute at UC Berkeley is releasing a new report today by Alan Burson, Mike Hurst, and myself. I think we have it on the web page, and we could call that up. It's called Getting Beyond the Facts, Reforming California School Finance, and those of you who are joining by webcast can find it very easily by just Googling the Earl Warren Institute, UC Berkeley, and it's right on that site. In this report, we propose a new framework for school finance that is more rational, more equitable, and we believe politically feasible. And at its core, it's very simple. Our proposal links district revenue to student needs and regional costs while holding all districts harmless at current funding levels. We undertake a series of simulations in the report to show that significant improvement in the finance system can be achieved with modest new investment. I'll explain a little bit about the details of the program in a second, but let me begin with 4 observations that tie our proposal to the current budget crisis. First, it may seem counterintuitive to propose ambitious school finance reform in a very lean budget year. But the reality, I think, is that now is an especially good time to discuss reform because in good budget years, there is little appetite for this kind of discussion. Instead, lawmakers tend to use available money to create new programs that may later prove to be either unsustainable, unnecessary, or irrelevant to core student needs. And because of a declining enrollment, the LAO has projected that new money will be available for education over the next 5 to 7 years. And the LA Times pointed out, I think quite aptly in January, that the wrong time to plan the expenditure of new funds is when the new funds suddenly appear. We have a critical window of opportunity right now to create a system that will allocate new money fairly and efficiently as it becomes available. My second observation is that much has been already said in the literature and in the policy discussions about the complexity of the finance system and its 80 different revenue streams. One major consequence of this complexity is inefficiency. Efficiency, meaning educational output per dollar invested, is especially important when money is scarce. So it's true, we have to increase education spending in California, but we also have to make our education dollars go farther. Our proposal would consolidate state aid into 3 simple revenue streams, and this builds on the Getting Down to Facts research showing that lawmakers get a bigger boost in the state API for their aid dollars if they provide those dollars in the form of unrestricted aid instead of categorical aid. Third, the complexity of the system makes it difficult for lawmakers and the public to understand why each district gets the level of funding it gets. And if lawmakers can't understand or explain where money goes and why, then even in a bad budget year, it may be difficult to convince a skeptical public why it should spend more money on K-12 education. Fourth and finally, the incoherence of the system has a deeper consequence, I think, that underlies the current budget debate. You know, as Rick mentioned, California has developed strong academic standards. We have a decent accountability system. We require our students to pass a high school exit exam. But we do not determine the education budget each year based on any educational judgment as to what it costs to enable our students and schools to meet the performance goals we've set for them. The premise of the governor's proposal for across-the-board cuts is that no single program or set of programs has priority over another. And in a sense, I think the governor is right. The 80 different revenue streams comprising our finance system reflect an historical accretion of programs rather than a rational legislative judgment as to how much money is actually needed to get the results we want and which students and schools need the resources the most. Thank goodness the LAO is around to suggest such priorities, but the long-term solution is that this must be a legislative judgment that informs the very framework of our finance system and not just the ad hoc spending level in a bad budget year. So our report proposes a new framework that focuses lawmakers on these basic questions of adequacy, equity, and efficiency. And in doing so, it aligns the finance system with the educational priorities already reflected in our state standards and accountability system. So let me just say a few words very briefly about our report. It's actually quite simple. First slide just shows a brief overview of the key features of the California school finance system, which have already been discussed. The key one I'd like to focus on is that differences in student needs and regional costs are not systematically accounted for in the finance system. In other words, the finance system is relatively unresponsive to the greater educational costs arising from students who have particular disadvantages, as well as the higher cost of hiring good teachers in different areas. The next slide shows how school funding varies by a level of poverty in a particular district. So this is all the unified districts in California, which comprise roughly 70-something% of all students. And if you just focus on the darker dots, the medium and larger districts, they comprise about 2/3 of all ADA. What you notice is that it's a pretty flat distribution. In other words, from very low levels of poverty to very high levels of poverty, the districts get roughly the same amount, within maybe a $500 or $750 band. So our proposal, next slide, would implement some very basic principles. First of which is that revenue allocation should be guided by student needs. And then secondly, it should also be adjusted for regional cost differences. And then third and fourth, it has to be transparent, simple to understand, and easily explained by the people who implement it. And then lastly, it must hold districts harmless and implement the proposal using new money going forward. In terms of nuts and bolts, the basic components are very simple too. There are three major revenue streams that we think are important as forming the core of any finance system. First, a stream of base funding that provides what you might think of as the adequate amount of funding for the average student to reach state standards. This covers the basic costs of textbooks, materials, teachers, maintaining decent and safe facilities, and supplying really the basics of the educational program. Secondly, we propose a consolidation of various special education funding streams with a desire to continue the equalization process begun by the legislature in 1997 to get greater equality across the different local planning areas for special education in the state. And then third, I think this is our perhaps most important component, we propose a program of targeted funding that is based on an unduplicated count of the English learners and low-income students in the state that is also linked to the concentration of those students in particular districts. So we think that it's important not just that money be given out on the basis of each child who is in this disadvantaged group, but also based on the district characteristic, meaning how concentrated are those children in a particular district, and increase the funding based on concentration. And then finally, we would adjust all of these program allocations with regional cost adjustments that are based on how much it costs to hire college-educated workers in particular regions. As you might expect, there are high-cost regions in the state, such as the Bay Area and in Southern California. There are lower-cost regions in the northern counties and in some places in the south as well. And we need to adjust for that because California is a very diverse state with diverse costs. And lastly, as I mentioned before, we would implement this program largely with new money going forward, holding all districts harmless at current levels. The report has within it a number of simulations. Here I show Table 5 of the report, which contains a series of simulations with various parameters for the base, special education, and targeted programs. And I simply would mention here that if you look, for example, at the middle option that I've laid out, and low, middle, and high only refer to terms relative to each other. They're not in any absolute sense low, middle, or high. The bottom line figures in bold there show that for $7 to $8 billion greater investment in 2004-05, which is roughly a 15 to 20% increase over the level of that year, we could have had a program that supplied $6,200 in the base program, an equalized special education allotment of $700, and a targeted program that put an additional $2,000 sliding scale upwards to $4,000 per child who is either an English learner or a low-income student. So this is what it would look like, the graph that I showed you earlier. This is what it would look like for all unified districts under our middle option in 2004-05. You see that the curve is much more upward sloping, and the base level of funding is much higher. So whereas the bottom dots in the first graph started somewhere around 6,000, they now start around 7,000, and they curve upward to about 9,000 and 9,500 for the highest poverty districts. Lastly, our report doesn't address a bunch of important issues that really need further work. So we need a process for figuring out how the base and targeted funding parameters ought to be set from year to year, and an ongoing process for revising those based on available research. Second, we need to understand how best to incentivize and hold districts accountable for spending the money in ways that best target students to help their performance. Our proposal addresses only the state to district allocation, but not district allocations to schools. And then lastly, without recreating the entire complexity of the categorical system, what mix of incentives, regulation, or other best practices can we implement to assure that funds are used effectively? This is, I think, one of the $64,000 questions floating in Sacramento. We all want categorical reform, but what do we do in its place to ensure the accountability that we want? I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. A reminder that I'm John Fensterwald, editorial writer of the San Jose Mercury News, and this is Welcome to Understanding California's School Funding Crisis, the first event of the California Media Collaborative, a new nonprofit initiative for enhancing coverage of California's key issues. And we're fortunate today to have with us legislative analyst Elizabeth Hill, Rick Pratt of the California School Boards Association, and Professor Goodwin Liu, who just spoke. You can get copies of their PowerPoint slides if you send to this email address, dw127@media.berkeley.edu. And you can also, please mail us your questions. We have plenty of time now for that. So let's start. Rick, you're the guy in the middle. Let me ask you, what do you think of Goodwin's proposal? Is this something that you think that you could sell your membership? There would be no winners and losers per se. Everyone would be held harmless, but clearly new revenue would go to some districts and not others. But on the principle of providing that money to children of need, where do you think your association might come down?
Well, I think on the whole it would be favorable. I think it's an interesting proposal. I like the way that it gets at the categories of base and targeted spending. And I think, there's a lot to recommend it. We have, as an organization for a long time, have been saying that, we, with the old California Public School Accountability Act that was first initiated under Gray Davis, or enacted under Gray Davis, we have attempted to move to an output-based accountability system where school districts are evaluated and judged based on student learning. And that was supposed to have been instead of the input compliance-based accountability system that predated the Public School Accountability Act. We now live in a world where we have both, and it's probably the worst of all possible worlds. So, and I think that, some of the characteristics that we like about that proposal are the same characteristics that we like about the analyst proposal with the block grants, that you can give districts more flexibility, more decision-making ability over the use of those dollars so that you can meet local needs, which is not to say that it's not important or desirable to have funding streams that are categorical. A lot of times when we talk about categorical programs, we talk about the fact that we've got all these different funding streams out there that have to be spent on certain programs. That's one issue. But another issue, which I think is at least as important, if not more so, which I think is addressed by both proposals, is the requirements that are attached to those funding streams. For example, it may be desirable to have dollars that are earmarked just for professional development so that districts have those resources available. It's questionable as to whether it's desirable for the state to determine at the state level what the content of that professional development should be. And I think that both of those proposals address that. The one, though, overarching concern I have with Professor Liu's proposal is it tries to, in certain respects, go into opposite directions. The simplicity. We want something that's simple and transparent. Well, the most simple, or the simplest formula would be to give every district the same amount of money per student. But then that doesn't meet the need to be able to be fair and equitable in addressing the needs of those districts that are going to have higher cost students or that are facing different regional cost differences. Or at one point in the report, there's even talk about differential funding by grade level. And so the more you go in the direction of fairness and equity, you add more and more layers of complexity. So you could be simple on the one hand or fair on the other. So I think that policymakers take this kind of stuff seriously. So instead of telling them that we can come up with a formula that meets both criteria, we need to be leveling with them and saying, look, you've got to figure out what the right balance is. You know, how much do we want to go in the direction of simplicity versus how much do we want to go in the direction of fairness and equity? Personally, I think fairness and equity probably should be given greater weight, but that's something to be determined.
Mm-hmm. Well, I noticed that in the governor's Committee on Education Excellence also came out for sort of this weighted student formula idea, but at the same time it came up with a number of areas that it would put money in. It wouldn't necessarily trust the districts to spend all the money wisely. It would put it in for performance-based pay and professional development. But what Goodwin, your proposal says, provide the money and let us assume that the districts would use the money wisely?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think there are a lot of similarities between what Ted Mitchell's group, the governor's committee's group, came up with and what we propose as well. And I think that bodes well, and also what Liz talked about bodes well for the convergence, I think, of some of this discussion towards a number of solutions that resemble one another. I take Rick's point about the trade-off between simplicity and equity. I would settle for the term simpler, simpler than what we have, even if it is not simple by any absolute measure. On this question of how we would, in essence, incentivize or regulate districts in their own uses of funds, let me make a couple comments about that. First of all, I think it is correct to say that the term categorical program should not be thought of as somehow a dirty word in California education politics. Categorical programs were created for a reason, and in many instances, those reasons were salutary. We have kids in our system who are not being served by the system, and one way to ensure that they were served was to create dedicated revenue streams for their needs. That is the philosophy. The reality, I think, has emerged to be a little bit different, but I think it's important to remember that original philosophy. And one thing that I would say about the proposal that we have on the table is that by driving a lot of dollars to districts with concentrated poverty or concentrated EL populations, in some sense, the idea of regulating that money to ensure that it is spent on those kids becomes is kind of obviated, because I did some runs on the numbers last night, and I found that 65% of EL kids and 65% of low-income kids in our model, for example, are in districts with greater than 60% concentration of those kids. And about 3/4 of our dollars in the targeted program are devoted to those districts. So in essence, to say that those dollars must be spent on those kids is kind of redundant, because in many of those places, that's the majority of the kids. So when we give the money, if we concentrate it in that fashion, we don't have to, in a sense, worry as much about the dollars being siphoning off elsewhere, because those are the kids that are there to be served. So that's the first point. The second point, I think, is that we do have to think differently about the way in which we exact the kind of accountability we want from local school districts. And what I mean by that is that for a long time, the categorical model, I think, has largely been a command and control kind of regulatory system. The state is above the locals, and they set the rules, and then the locals comply, in essence, with a set of legal requirements. I think we have to think more broadly, and I think the governor's report was very on point about this, about ways in which we create a culture of continuous improvement and best practices that is less about forcing people through law and regulation to spend money in particular ways, more about developing a set of understandings among professionals, principals, teachers, and district officials, a set of understandings about what constitutes good practice. And that's something I think we can't take for granted because we've never asked our local school officials to take on that role. Over the course of the last 20, 30 years, instead, we've been in the command and control business. And so we need to think about how to develop the right incentives and capacity for school officials at the local level to spend money better. And that, I think, you may call it a slightly softer approach, but I think this set of alternatives needs to be quite seriously explored.
Thank you. Before we get back to more of the crisis at hand, do you have any thoughts about Goodwin's philosophy going into it and the general approach that he and Mike Kirst and Ron Burson are taking?
Well, I haven't seen the report released today, but certainly as Professor Liu summarized it, I was struck by a number of similarities between the categorical program reform that we offered and what Professor Liu spoke about, particularly related to base funding, a targeted approach to special education, also to have a targeted approach in other categorical areas. And I think the accountability issue that he just remarked about is also a really critical factor, and we share the concern there. For that reason and our opportunity to learn block grant, we suggest a number of ways to move from process to outcome orientation to ensure that both districts have the flexibility, but also that districts have the right incentives to ensure that particularly disadvantaged students are receiving the services that they really need in order to meet the standards of the state of California.
Okay, thank you. Reminder that you can send your questions to our panelists at dw127@media.berkeley.edu. So Rick, come back to the LAO's proposal, alternative proposal. Why hasn't it been immediately embraced? It's a huge difference in the amount of money that would go towards education.
Right.
And yet when it got to the Senate, Joe Simidian lost his position on the Budget Committee because Don Prada said, no, we're not going to even consider some of those aspects.
Right.
Where's the association on this, and why is there seemingly so much resistance?
I think one of the excuse me, features of the analyst proposal is to give the legislature more flexibility in the budget year regarding the funding level for schools. I mean, that's how it's been expressed at committee hearings. One of the things that's been expressed. And but you notice that the proposal would still require a suspension of Proposition 98. It would be a smaller suspension, but it would still be a suspension. And in our view, once suspension is in the works, that by itself gives the legislature maximum flexibility over what the level of funding would be in any year in which you suspend, because when you suspend Proposition 98, the bottom falls out of the guarantee, and you can fund schools at any level. So suspension itself is all you need for maximizing flexibility. The problem we have is in the current year part of that proposal, which is to reduce the appropriation for Proposition 98 down to the minimum level of the guarantee, and doing that by swapping out dollars that are owed to schools and community colleges from prior years, and it's roughly $1 billion. And doing that would result in a permanent loss of that $1 billion to schools and community colleges. So that's the issue we have. You know, we would get under the analyst proposal $2 billion next year, but then we would lose on an ongoing basis or one-time basis that $1 billion. Now, one thing that is sort of added to that level of concern is that right now that $1 billion is being used to pay off the debt that the state owes for schools, to schools and community colleges for unpaid mandated costs over the past several years. And actually the analyst has done a good job in prior analyses of keeping track of this, what she calls a K-12 credit card. And this has been a funding stream that we've used to pay off that credit card. If we lose that funding stream, then where do we get the dollars for those mandated costs? We either get it from within Prop 98, ongoing Prop 98 costs, which means that something else is going to be at risk, or we get it from outside of Proposition 98, which means that then you build the 98 guarantee, which the legislature and the governor have been reluctant to do. So I think that when the issue came up in the Budget Committee earlier this year, when Senator Simidian was really pushing for the analyst proposal, I think that part of the motivation there was the hope that with the analyst proposal, we could have avoided suspension altogether, and there would have been no need to make that 2/3 vote to Proposition 98. That also, though, is a concern to us, because the way that gets spun in the media and by the governor and by legislative leadership is that any year in which Proposition 98 is not suspended is described as a year in which schools are fully funded. And that's really not the case. And in fact, that was the way the budget was characterized this year by the governor and legislative leadership, that schools are fully funded. The fact is that that budget did not contain about $1 billion of unpaid mandates. It continued deficiencies in funding for supplemental instruction programs like summer school and after-school programs. It continued deficiencies in funding for nutrition programs. So there were a lot of needs out there, part of which were on this K-12 credit card, that the budget did not meet. So it's not the same thing when Proposition 98 is fully funded. It's not the same thing as saying schools are fully funded. Basically, it's a way of saying that the budget contains the least amount of money necessary to meet the minimum requirements of Proposition 98. But that's not the same thing as saying schools are fully funded. So it would not have been necessarily a good thing to find a different way of getting to the same level of funding next year and then say, yeah, but schools are fully funded, because that gives the wrong impression.
Liz, would you disagree with any of that characterization?
Well, as I mentioned, John, at the outset when we were organizing the forum, I'm not a K-14 expert, but a couple different observations. Remember that when the budget was enacted, revenues have dropped about $9 billion since then. So one of the arguments that, from our point of view, is important is that we not only settle up when the economy does better and schools are old more, but we have to consider also occasions when we have to settle down, if you will, because the Proposition 98 guarantee has dropped significantly from when the budget was enacted to where it is today. That also being said, as we speak, the California economy is not performing very well. The subprime mortgage situation has really hit California very hard. Also, the price of oil is hitting California very hard. And we actually don't know whether our estimates today of a $16 billion budget problem may grow at the time of the May revision. In fact, the cost of living adjustment required for schools under statute has also gone up since January 10th when the governor presented his view. So our concern for the legislature really, I think, goes to the same point that Rick mentioned. What do we need to fund in schools to actually meet the academic standards of the state of California? And that isn't necessarily the minimum guarantee. But in order to ensure that the legislature has the maximum amount of ability to meet that crucial decision, what is needed to fund schools, we think it's important to go down to the minimum guarantee in the current fiscal year. That could be done without a negative impact to the schools in the current fiscal year. But it is all of a balancing act. And I think the key is, what do we need for students in the long term?
So, I mean, all three of you, would you agree then that the idea is then to come up with an amount of what is adequate to educate each child, and then have a revenue stream that doesn't gyrate the way that the state revenue system does, so that it's not subjected to these constant cuts?
No, I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
I mean, I think that adequacy has a lot of different definitions, and as Professor Liu mentioned, his proposal would require a modest new investment. I don't know what a modest new investment is in his view, but right now we have a $16 billion budget problem. So we can't even fund current program levels without taking some major action. We're concerned, at least from our office's perspective, that we at least maintain current funding rather than do a cut as the governor has proposed.
Could you remind us, for those in the media who need this reminder, how when you suspend Proposition 98, what happens, and then how it's made up in future years, and which aspects are categoricals covered by the Prop 98 guarantee? In other words, then what happens 2-3 years out from now?
Well, I'll start and let others jump in. I think what's first important for folks to recognize is that Prop 98 is not intuitive. It's a very complicated formula that changes by a lot of factors. So, for example, if the state of California gets more money in some years, nothing happens with the Prop 98 guarantee. In some cases, 50% of the money goes to the Prop 98 guarantee, and sometimes all of the money goes to Prop 98. So Prop 98 isn't an intuitive formula. So it's just important, I think, to step back from all the formulas and know that it's really intended that Prop 98 grow with the economy. So in the event of a suspension, the schools over time would get back to where they otherwise would have been. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. Sometimes it takes longer to get there than others, depending on these factors that are in the state constitution.
And would they get back to the same amount under your proposal as the governor's proposal?
I don't have that number in my brain this morning.
Yeah. The answer is yes, ultimately.
Yeah.
But I think that one thing that needs to be a little clarified, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means to get back to that long-term trend line, because some people interpret that to mean that the dollars that we lose in any year of a suspension or any subsequent year get repaid. That's not the case. But what happens is that the funding level gradually gets restored to the level that it would have been if suspension had never occurred.
I see.
And that's a very important point that Rick has mentioned, because it's not a loan, it's getting schools back to where they otherwise would have been.
Okay. Now, there's a technical aspect in the governor's proposal, and Tony asked me to explain it. I'm glad you're here. And that's it's a $2 billion revenue accrual.
Yes.
And that's a huge amount of money. And you oppose that use of it. Could you explain it and then say why not? Because if you thought it was a good idea, then basically we would be back to where we were and then some.
Well, remember that the governor's budget assumes this $2 billion accrual, which is basically to take money that otherwise would be received in the 2009-10 fiscal year and pull it into the 2008-9 fiscal year. So his estimates of the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee already include that $2 billion. So when he talks about a $4 billion suspension, that's taking into account that amount of money. We think it's poor tax policy, what has been proposed by the administration, and so we recommend that it not be adopted by the legislature. The $2 billion accrual proposal is not part of our alternative budget proposal, but rather we raise money by the closing of various tax expenditures, which is a technical budget speak term for exclusions, deductions, and credits in the tax code.
Rick, do you have a position on that? Could you take $800 million of it and then wouldn't have to suspend 98?
We don't have a position on that accrual proposal per se. My understanding is that the legislature is not likely to go along with it.
Okay. Reminder to send your questions to dw127@media.berkeley.edu. We do have some questions coming in. I thank those watching. What happens to class size reduction under your proposal, Liz?
Under our proposal, class size reduction, both K-3 class size reduction and 9th grade class size reduction would be part of our base block grant. We are concerned that being in the block grant, that there still be some protections regarding class size reduction. And so, for example, money would have to be spent in various increments, K-3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9 through 12. But at the same time, it would unlock some of the difficulties that school districts have faced as to losing class size reduction money if they went over 20 pupils per classroom. So it would give districts a lot more flexibility to meet local priorities, still spending within K-3 in terms of the amount, but if that meant 21 or 22 students in some cases, and in other districts meant 18 students, that would be a local decision that could be made by the local district.
Rick, are you hearing from the districts that class size reduction is one of the targets now that under the budget cuts? I'm hearing that because it is an expensive program.
Right,
it's not fully
and
covered.
in some areas it is. In fact, we've seen this over the past couple of years where some districts have either cut back on the number of grade levels that they do class size reduction, or in maybe a small number of cases getting out of it altogether, because the amount that the districts receive from the state for class size reduction doesn't fully cover the cost, the local cost of class size reduction. So we hear that it's not something new that this year, is something that's been going on the past couple of years, because we've had, this is a real bad year, but it's on top of some very tight years that we've had, so it's an ongoing issue and concern. And we appreciate the level of flexibility for class size reduction that the analyst's proposal would contain. We've actually have sponsored bills in the past that would have given districts some flexibility on the cap for class size reduction. They have not succeeded. When I say we like it, that would be the California School Boards Association, but other groups like the California Teachers Association don't like that.
Thank you. Goodwin, a question for you. Wouldn't proposing spending based on students' needs open up huge political battles between districts and legislators representing those districts?
Well, I suppose in one sense the answer would be yes, in the sense that our proposal does create differential gains among districts based on their characteristics. We have in our report, for example, a list of 30 unified districts, fairly large districts, over 20,000 kids, that show sort of before and after comparisons under our simulation as to what they would get. This is all, of course, with the caveat that all districts are held harmless, and in fact all districts would probably gain something under our proposal, especially those that are large and have significant populations of disadvantaged kids. So I would simply say that on the equity principle, there ought to be differentiation in how much districts get. Right now we have a situation where within a $500 band of spending, you can find districts that are 75% low income down to 10 or 5% low income. And that's just not, I think, an equitable way to fund schools when we expect all kids to reach the same standards, and we know that more resources are needed to help some kids to get there. Let me make an additional comment, if I might, about your question, John, about adequacy. And I take Liz's point about our phrase modest new investment. One person's modesty, I'm sure, is another person's excess. And so it's difficult to use terms like that. But let me just make one small qualification, which is that in our report, we model the numbers based on 2004-05 data that were supplied by research done by the Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC. It took a significant effort by PPIC just to understand what happened in a particular budget year, district by district, program by program, and that complexity is, figuring out that complexity is a great credit to what PPIC did. The LAO has reported that since the 2004-05 year, we can think of the education system as having had around $5 billion of increased investment above COLA, above the level of program workload adjustments, meaning the growth in enrollment. And so the simulation figures that I gave in terms of new investment don't account for that $5 billion, which gets you, I think, part of the way there in terms of some of the amounts that we suggest might be necessary. But the broader point really is that the framework that we're proposing is not something that we would urge the legislature certainly to do this year or even next year, in the sense of providing the large sums that are necessary to create a significantly targeted program and such. Those are things I think that we work towards over a longer period of time. But what's important is to get into place the framework in which that discussion can then occur. Because if we wait until we have $5 billion, $7 billion, or $8 billion more money in the system, which, the economy goes up and down, and historical experience shows that, there will be another year sometime in the future when the state is flush. If we wait until then to have this discussion, it's almost guaranteed that it won't happen, because there is no sense of urgency at that point about how the finance system is structured and whatnot. The only urgency there is how can we spend that money in ways that most benefit our constituents visibly and directly at that time, but that is not a long-term vision in terms of how to fund schools adequately. So I would simply say that if the simulations cause you to gasp in terms of how much additional money might be necessary, I'd say don't think about that just now. Think instead about the fundamental framework we'd like school finance to be governed by, and then as new money becomes available, we fill in that framework, but getting the framework in place is really important.
But if there is categorical reform, or if that districts are provided all that flexibility this year to spend the money how they want, would that make it harder to enact your proposal? Would that remove that money that you were counting on for your proposal? Is there a conflict somehow?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the angle of the question in terms of removing money, but I would simply say that I think that it is not accidental that there's some convergence between what the LAO has proposed and what we propose in terms of some consolidation. Because if you think about the basic notion of efficiency, and you think about efficiency defined as moving resources to its best uses, right? One of the ways in which efficiency, I think, is achieved is by enabling people who are closest to the situation to think about what are the best uses of the money. And so I think that in fact, far from removing dollars, I think we enable dollars even in the current year or the next budget year to go farther, even if we're not able to get the large increases that might be equitable for the future.
Here's a question from a political realist. The need for school finance reform has been documented for years. What will it take, politically speaking, to overcome all the entrenched interests? I'm remembering how former Senator D.D. Alpert tried to collapse a bunch of categoricals a few years ago and got pretty chewed up by the legislative process. Rick, I don't know if you want to consider yourself one of those entrenched interests, but I'll let you.
Well, actually, she finally succeeded to a certain extent. I think it was SB 825 that did block grant certain categorical programs, and we actually supported her effort in that area. But you're right, and it's not just political interest at the state level, it's political interest at the local level. When I worked at the analyst office, I learned that one of the most vocal groups out there were the parents of the GATE kids, gifted and talented education. And that's a local constituency as much or even more so than a statewide constituency. So it is very difficult to get people who feel, rightly or wrongly, that they benefit from a certain program to feel comfortable with collapsing that into other kinds of programs. But I think that one thing that is different now than it has been in the past is that when it comes to accountability and trying to hold districts accountable for results, one of the weaknesses of the Public School Accountability Act was that you only looked at school-wide average test scores. We did not break those scores down by student subgroups, so we didn't look to see how students in poverty were doing, or English language learners were doing, or minority students were doing in their academic performance. That was changed by the No Child Left Behind Act, which I think that's probably the best feature of that act, was that it forced us to take a look at those performance levels within subgroups, so that a low performance among one or more subgroups couldn't be hidden in a good average score for the school as a whole. So I think that I have a couple of years' experience with that kind of accountability now, and I think that raises the stakes locally, and it adds more transparency, to use an overused word now, to the whole accountability effort. So I think that once policymakers and then local constituencies feel comfortable with that level of accountability, they may feel more comfortable with things like block granting or relaxing some of the strings that are attached to some of these categorical dollars.
Good one. Yeah.
Could I add? I think the question obviously is a very good one, and hard to sort of get out from the current situation and sort of look around above towards the long term. But Alan Burson, who is one of our co-authors on the report, I think usefully pointed out in our earlier discussion that although it's often said that the status quo has powerful inertia in the California education political scene, it's actually the case that there's been a lot of change over the last 20 or 30 years in finance and in standards. So we have had, over the course of this time, gradual but steady equalization of the revenue limit system. Originally, I think, spurred on by court decision, but then it sort of took a life of its own so that now actually we have pretty equalized revenue limit. We managed to create a large system of, a quite good system of standards, a decent accountability system, aided a little bit or spurred on, depending on your perspective, by No Child Left Behind. But California actually was a leader in developing good standards as far back as the early 90s. We've had special education reform that changed the way in which special education money was allocated and try to get those to be more equal. And further, we most recently, I think, had a reform of the way economic impact aid is given out, which also creates winners and losers and whatnot. But my point is that we have accomplished some of these things in smaller increments, to be sure, but it's not the case that every time there's a division between winners and losers that nothing ever happens. At times, we do figure out that there are more important principles that need to be vindicated in the overall system, and the legislature and the governor are able to act on them.
Do you foresee the current budget cuts as sort of accentuating the inequities in the system? And by that I mean, will the wealthier districts pass parcel taxes? I read where a couple of East Bay districts are asking parents to come and give hundreds of dollars each to make up the difference, and obviously there will be districts that can't afford to do this. So if the budget cuts are enacted, would we have a more inequitable system than we started? Or is that overstated?
It's hard to say. I think that you already see some of that anyway. You see some districts passing parcel taxes and other districts not. You see some districts that have very active fundraising from parents and others in the school community. So that's not going to be anything new. As to whether or not that's going to be accentuated with the budget cuts, it's hard to say. The one area where I think you'll find a differential impact of the budget cuts is in the small number of districts that we refer to as basic aid districts. There is a different number every year, but basically, 30, 35, or 40, maybe 45 districts, and these are the districts that are inaptly named because they're actually districts that don't require state funding to meet their revenue limit. Their local property tax revenue is in excess of their revenue limit. And because the 10% across-the-board reduction for revenue limits only applies to the state share of that and not to local property tax share, those districts' revenue limits will not experience the cuts that the other districts will. So that will be one inequity, which is just I don't think there's a fix for it, but it's just one feature of how we fund schools in California.
Someone sent in basically the same question I was offering, but how significant are these district foundations in providing money? Have you ever seen a dollar figure as to whether it's just enrichment or whether it's significant in some cases?
I think it is significant in some cases, but I have not seen dollar figures.
Right. Okay.
The Getting Down to Facts research did look at the foundations as systematically as it could. It's hard to study those things, and I think there's a high variance. So there are some districts for which there's great benefit, but on average across all the districts, it's a fairly low number, either 2 digits or low 3 digits.
Now, a number of districts have declining enrollments, and will the impact be disproportionate on them?
It's a problem. At least now half of the districts in the state are declining enrollment districts, and for a while the majority of them used to be the relatively small districts, but now it's Los Angeles Unified, San Francisco are declining enrollment. And the problem with declining enrollment is that your revenues go down at a steeper slope than your costs go down. You could lose, put it down to the classroom level. You might lose, 2 students out of a classroom. Will you lose the entire level of funding that those 2 students bring, but you really haven't saved any cost because you still have to have the same teacher. You have to turn the lights on. Maybe you have to buy fewer books, and so you have some marginal savings there. But the savings that districts realize from losing students is not as great as the revenue that they lose. And so that is just something that's going to accentuate the budget cuts.
And over the next several years, what are the projections for total enrollment in the state?
Well, it's going to be going back up. I don't know if you have those numbers, but it's going to be going back up in the next couple of years statewide. But even within that, we'll always have declining enrollment districts.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard the argument. I guess Senator Ackerman said, at a time of declining enrollment in the state, how to justify additional money for schools? And
I mean, I think on that point it is important to recognize that we have more than 1,000 districts in California. Some districts, for example, that are high school only districts, they've still been growing at a time that the K-12 portion of the, so it's really important to look at the details in your individual communities. I think from an overall budget perspective, however, it's important to note that as the declining enrollment or declines in student population in K-12 ends, it will then hit the higher education portion of the state budget as that demographic group slows down, and will also then put pressures in higher education with less enrollment coming to higher ed.
I think maybe we've touched on this question already. How does the LAO's proposal hold school districts accountable for how they spend block grant money?
We do offer specific recommendations in each of the block grants for outcome measurements. In some cases, it's our view that there's adequate data already that then the legislature can use in accountability. In others, particularly with our Opportunity to Learn block grant, we're very concerned with regard to disadvantaged students to ensure that the outcome measurement is really much more systematic than what we have today to ensure student success.
Okay. Again, a reminder, if you want to send in questions, send it to dw127@media.berkeley.edu. And the question of, another question, fortunately. I'm curious what the panel believes is a likely time frame for actually getting an improved system in place.
An improved system in place?
Yes.
An improved K-12 system?
Yes, improved. I'm sorry? Oh.
Is it an improved budget or
an approved? Oh, I'm sorry. An approved system in place. I guess we're talking about this year.
Well, I think I'd first like to echo a couple of Professor Liu's comments. I think that the opportunity to really plan for the long term is important to keep in mind. I do think that when we face challenging times, as both Rick and he mentioned, there are opportunities for change. As to when this year's budget will be done, I think that's very hard to say. April is the largest revenue collection month for the state of California. All observers will be tracking those revenue collections very carefully because that not only, of course, affects schools, but it affects all other state services. And whether the budget problem will have worsened or improved at that point will certainly affect when we get an ultimate package enacted.
You know, we wanted to give you a chance to offer us advice. Those reporters and editors who are watching this today, it's really, we've described big numbers in terms of the budget, but how do you, if you were going to give advice to reporters covering their own school districts, on how to, make this situation aware to their readers, to the reality of the budget cuts? Have you any suggestions as to how you would, story ideas or stories you would cover and sort of to grasp the enormousness of what's we're facing? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think of necessity, and Rick mentioned this, that for K-12 schools as well as the community colleges, it's not just a numbers game. And while we've been talking a lot about numbers today, we've also been talking about numbers and averages and statewide totals. And what I would really suggest is that reporters really talk to their local school districts. How do those averages translate at the local level? what does it mean, as Rick mentioned earlier, if you don't have a summer school program or an after-school program? What sort of fiscal flexibility or programmatic flexibility is needed at the local school district? Has it been an impediment to have the rigid class size reduction program that the state has in kindergarten through grade 3? What would they suggest as ways that the state should modify? So I think it's to get beyond the numbers and really look at the local circumstance. As Professor Liu mentioned, what are the number of disadvantaged students being served? What are the number of special needs students? And so it really translates, I think, what the budget situation as we've been discussing this morning into reality on the ground.
Yeah, I would concur with that. It's really important to get behind the numbers. I don't think the public really gets a good handle on what the numbers mean, whether you're talking about $10,000 or $4.8 billion. I think that at a certain point the numbers become unreal and meaningless. So it really is important to get beneath the numbers and, talk to your local school board officials or your local school district officials, budget people, parents, and find out at the programmatic level, not even at the level of how many teachers are being laid off or how many custodians or bus drivers are being laid off, but what does this mean in terms of programs and services?
Goodwin.
I concur completely. I think that there is a tremendous magnetism to looking at numbers and especially the broad type of averages that we offer in a report like ours. I agree with Rick. The best way to do that, I think, is to sit down with a district official who really understands the budget and take a couple hours to walk through how money is spent. And I would add on top of that, for comparison, it would be useful for journalists who really have the time and the gumption to do it, to do that same exercise in another state that funds education at a higher level than California. Go to Maryland, go to Michigan, go to New Jersey or New York. Ask a district official there to walk through how money is spent and what it's used on at a higher level in a district with perhaps a similar demographic to a district in the journalist's own community. And that will give, I think, a much more realistic idea of what is at stake in the current budget crisis as well as the long term for California school finance.
We hear it said all the time, oh, there's too much fat in the budget or too many administrators or too much bureaucracy. And in fact, I think one of the first moves to protect the classrooms is for districts to assign administrators back to the classrooms. But so the question is, what won't be done when this happens, or how administratively overweight are we in our schools? Rick, have you a sense?
I don't recall the numbers, but the National Center for Education Statistics will produce data on administrators per student or students per administrator, and California is right down near the bottom in terms of administrators per student, in terms of counselors per student, in terms of librarians per student or school nurses. And to the extent that there is too much administration, I think part of that can be laid at the feet of the number of categorical programs that each have their different compliance rules, and so you've got to have somebody who is in charge of making sure that the district is in compliance with the use of those dollars. That's administration. But if anything, I think schools are under-administered. I know that one of the things that we're hearing now in high schools is that a lot of districts, as a result of the budget situation, are contemplating eliminating like vice principal or assistant principal positions in high schools. And that would be a bad thing to happen. A lot of people like to talk about merit pay for teachers, pay for performance, ignoring that the administrative costs of that kind of system are very, very high. And so I think that, as I said, schools, if anything, are under-administered and could use a lot more instructional and curriculum supervision at the school site level than what we currently have.
Mm-hmm. So these are the administrators who will be evaluating the performance.
Exactly.
and also handling discipline problems and other
Right.
things. And I've also heard from a superintendent of a program improvement district who said this comes at the worst time, because just when they feel that they're making progress, in some improvements, now we're going to lose money. And if we keep some of the extra programs that we have, shadow classes and the like, then we have to eliminate electives and other things that students find valuable. Have any of you been hearing from districts of similar situations?
Well, I know that statewide, we've made tremendous gains on our academic performance index. And at the elementary level, for example, a score that 5 or 6 years ago would have put a district in the 5th percentile academically, that same score would put that district in the lowest, first, or I should say decile, the lowest decile. And so across the board, schools are improving and making tremendous gains. And the programs that are in place to help realize those gains are the ones that are most at risk, because they're the programs that are sort of, the after school, the summer school programs, the ones that are outside of the regular classroom, that are the ones that are most at risk. And so I see if the governor's budget were to become reality, I see a real risk at losing that traction that we have gained. And I hear when we talk to the Department of Finance, they say, well, we're looking at maybe a 2-year time horizon, and economically we'll turn around, and state general fund will start coming back in, so we'll get back on our feet. But the problem is you're only in 2nd grade once, or you're only in 10th grade once. And the kinds of slippage that can occur is going to take a lot longer than an economic cycle to recover from.
Is one thing that reporters might consider is going to the CSUs and looking at the next generation of teachers? What impact will this have? I mean, for those people who are considering going into teaching when, in fact, they see layoff notices coming, and often the least senior teachers among them. Is that?
Well, I hate to monopolize.
Go ahead. Anyone.
I hear a lot from board members who are concerned about the level and the amount of layoffs that are going to be occurring now, because when it happens, it's last in, first out. So you lose the teachers that are fresh out of CSU, that have had the training and the education that is most aligned to our current curriculum standards in California. And they tell me up and down the state that their experience is once those young teachers are laid off, they never come back. And so it can, over the long term, exacerbate that teaching shortage. You're losing the very people that we want in the classroom. And the state really is losing an investment, because people pay tuition to go to CSU, but it doesn't cover the full cost. There's a public cost in training teachers, and that investment is lost as we laid off those teachers and then they never come back.
One final question to each of you. What would it take to make school finance reform happen? Goodwin, why don't you start?
Well, I think we're actually in the middle of a process right now that is that was I think spurred on by the Getting Down to Facts research that was commissioned last year. That research had a particular political history, whereby I think the various stakeholders, the players in the political system, are trying to come together in a essentially political process to force the system towards a better framework. There were disagreements about how that should occur, but the fact is we now have, I think, a broad scholarly consensus, at least, about the need for reform, and then a broad policy consensus about the need for reform. There are, I think, a bunch of initiatives going on in the legislature now, categorical reform working groups. There are bills in the legislature, in fact, 2 bills to be considered this afternoon in the Assembly Education Committee, that are, I think, headed in the right direction. So my sense is that there is some movement and some realization that we are at the point where this system that we have developed over the course of many years is no longer serving the purposes that it was originally designed for. So I would say, that there are some promising developments, but we have to keep pushing, and we ought to think about this process as an evolution. Meaning, although we look at the finance system today and say, boy, isn't that irrational or isn't that incoherent? it isn't the case that it was developed that way for no reason. It evolved through a series of policy decisions responsive to particular imperatives at the time. Today, we have a different set of imperatives. I think Rick put it quite nicely. We have an outcomes-based accountability system that is tethered to No Child Left Behind, and I think in many ways California's own philosophy was already in sync with No Child Left Behind before that even happened, and we simply haven't evolved or updated our finance system to reflect that current educational reality. And so this is a gradual evolution process, and being an optimist, I think eventually we will have a finance system that catches up to where the rest of the policy environment is already.
Liz, I think it'd probably be safe to say it won't happen until you retire. But are you optimistic about what Goodwin just said? Do you sense a change?
Well, I do remain optimistic. I think the problems have been identified over a long period of time. I think having a variety of proposals on the table helps facilitate that discussion. I think in part what has to happen are a couple things. We need to have a clear vision of what target we really want to meet in terms of a school finance reform and the programmatic consequences. I think also it's very difficult to do in tough economic times. Goodwin mentioned several times that his proposal tries to hold districts harmless. That certainly has historically been a concern the legislature's had. When you look at 1,000 districts, what are the impacts locally of reform? Can you hold harmless initially and then equalize over time? So some of those factors have to come into place. But I think first there has to be a consensus as to what the target is that we're really aiming for in terms of school finance reform.
Rick, the Ed Coalition has been very adamant about more money for education, less adamant about the other reforms that come with it.
Well, I think that's just the nature of the Education Coalition. You know, it started out 20 years ago as the Prop 98 Coalition, rallying around Proposition 98, which was on the ballot at that time. You know, it's a coalition of organizations that don't always see eye to eye on a number of issues. The teachers, the parents, classified employees, administrators, school board members. We have found that we are most successful over the years and in the legislature by focusing on just those things that we can agree on. And that tends to be the budget and tends to be money. There are a number of us in the coalition that can agree on some of the reforms we've been talking about today in terms of block granting or revising school finance. But not every organization in the coalition is there. So as a coalition, we tend not to weigh in on all of those policy issues, but as individual organizations, we certainly do.
I thank our panelists for coming today, Elizabeth Hill, Rick Pratt, Goodwin Liu, and thank you for watching and tuning in. You can receive copies of our PowerPoint today by sending them to the same email address, dw127@media.berkeley.edu. We'd also like your thoughts about the format today and any suggestions that you might have for future topics that the collaborative can consider. Thank you.